Good afternoon, Shalom, and welcome to Rebecca of Salerno. We're delighted to have the author with us. It's a book that has gotten great reviews, including one, and I'm going to read from the back cover, a rich historical tapestry, and I have to get better glasses, filled with fascinating characters and an intriguing page-turning story. It is both a historical novel and a mystery thriller. Before I introduce our author speaker, a little bit of advertising. Our go-to author series is sponsored by Under One Tent, a program of the Contra Costa JCC, Congregation B'nai Shalom, and the Jewish Book Council, in partnership with Diablo Valley Hadassah. So thank you to all our sponsors for allowing us to bring authors from around the world, actually, but here at San Francisco Bay Area, to our community. Okay. And also we encourage you to thank our authors from the Jewish Book Council who speak to us from the generosity of their hearts. And a way of thanking them is to purchase their book for yourself or your synagogue or group library. Like her heroine, Rebecca, Esther Erman was a refugee. A naturalized citizen, she early developed a passion for language, which led to her earning a doctorate in language education, writing her dissertation about the Yiddish language and working with international students on many levels. She is a multi-published author. Perhaps she'll talk to us about some of her books later on, and has recently returned from a wonderful trip to Europe and lives, as I said, in the Bay Area, where some of the things she's interested in is being a baker, a quilter, and a collector of books. And maybe we'll end with asking you, how many books are in your library? But before the end of our program, or at least towards the end, a few questions. And do think of questions yourself, because everyone brings to a novel or any book your own personality and interests. So, Esther, what inspired you to write this novel, which is really far away in history from your own or our lives?
Well, thank you all for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here today. The inspiration for the book was Walter Scott's Ivanhoe, in which he created the character of Rebecca. So in college, I was a French major. I have my bachelor's and master's in French, and I love French literature. But as a Jewish woman reading French literature, I needed to compartmentalize because there are virtually very few Jewish characters in classical French lit, and what there are villains. So here I loved this, but yet I had to kind of compartmentalize my identity. When I did my doctorate about actually the effects of the Holocaust on the Yiddish language on my dissertation, I did a survey of classic literature and discovered the character of Rebecca in Ivanhoe, which was written in 1820. It was like a breath of fresh air, even though he has a very high standard for Jewish women, but all of a sudden it was this positive character. And I was just so taken with her that she really grabbed hold of my imagination and held it for about 3 decades. So I always was thinking about this wonderful character and where did she come from and how did Walter Scott create her and what happened to her after Ivanhoe. So decades later, when I discovered the medical school in Salerno and knew that Rebecca and Ivanhoe was a healer, and the medical school in Salerno, which was real, men, women, Jews, Christians, Muslims could study together. I said, aha, That's the start of Rebecca's story. I just do want to add, it's not necessary to read Ivanhoe before you read Rebecca of Salerno, but probably you'll be inspired to know the story afterward.
You want to give us a 5-sentence recap of Ivanhoe?
Okay, and Ivanhoe is a very heroic character in England, returning from the Third Crusade he wanted to return with his king, Richard the Lionheart. And what happened was Richard the Lionheart was kidnapped on his way back to England. This is a little bit of a side, but anyway, I'll come back to that. So Ivanhoe returns to England, and he has a lady love, Rowena, who he had been pledged to before leaving on the crusade. Because his father offers hospitality to Rebecca's father, Isaac, at a time when Jews were not treated well in England, Isaac, in turn, wants to help Ivanhoe. This is the start of that relationship. And Rebecca is his wonderful daughter, who ends up kind of falling for chivalry and the knight Ivanhoe. Someone else falls for Rebecca, and Ivanhoe kidnaps her, and she is almost burned at the stake at the end of Ivanhoe because of being a healer. Ivanhoe rescues her, and at that point, she and her father decide it might be a good time to leave England. So heartbroken she does.
You mentioned something, I was going to ask a question anyhow, about people being burnt at the stake, usually because they were considered connected to the devil or witch, or etc. Did you do any research about the connection between healing, the healing arts, medicine, and magic?
That's an interesting question. Certainly, healing was considered a dark art, which is what opened up the danger to her at the time. One of the interesting things also when she went to medical school was that she was in Salerno, which was a Catholic area. Christians were not allowed to work with cadavers. So to study medicine, they actually had to work with pigs, which for a Jewish woman was a conflict. So there were complexities all over.
They go to Salerno, and I presume that the Duke and other assorted rulers in the region welcomed Jews. And a lot of times there was a reason, whether it's because in England, the Jews collected the taxes, making the population dislike the Jews rather than the king. Was there a particular reason in that century why Jews were especially welcome?
Well, it was interesting. Salerno was at that time in the Kingdom of Sicily, and this is an area that has been conquered repeatedly throughout history. So the Normans, who had conquered England, also had conquered the Kingdom of Sicily previously, and the atmosphere there had been one of tolerance for everyone. So instead of the Normans bringing intolerance, which they kind of did in England, they were seduced by the tolerant atmosphere of Sicily, and that included the Jews, and the Jews were able to blossom and to, certainly pay their share and more for things. However, okay, and this goes back to Richard the Lionheart being kidnapped in 1195. Richard the Lionheart had a very nasty younger brother who was known as John, and he is the King John who later on had to sign the Magna Carta. When he was kidnapped by the Holy Roman Emperor, the Hohenstaufens in Austria, on his way back from the Third Crusade, Richard's younger brother, John, had been king in his absence. John did not want to pay the ransom to get his brother liberated. Their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, was one who intervened, got the money. Now, the Hohenstaufens took that money and conquered the kingdom of Sicily with it. So this is where the connection between real history and the novels takes place. And the Hohenstaufens were not as tolerant as the Normans. So once they conquered the kingdom of Sicily, there was a deterioration of the atmosphere of tolerance that under which the Jews could blossom. And later on, kind of after my book, when Frederick, who had been a child at the conquest, comes into his full Holy Roman emperor status, Jews have to wear costumes, special clothing, and so on. So there's a deterioration of this wonderful atmosphere.
And what was happening eventually in England in regard to Jews? What eventually would befall our community way back then?
It's also really fascinating. The Jews were expelled from England in 1290. So certainly under King John, the world for Jews was deteriorating. Now, earlier in the 12th century, here's an example, again, something that I found was really fascinating. There was a woman named Lycuricia. Have people heard of her in England? Okay. In February last year, the town of Winchester erected a statue for honoring Lycuricia. She had been someone who was involved with money, with finances in the early 12th century. And she was married to her first husband who died. She married her second husband. Very interestingly, when her first husband died, the man who became her second husband was still married to his first wife. The king intervened in the Bet Din to get him a get. So if anyone ever said to you, did a king of England ever intervene in a Bet Din to get a get? There was one. He was Henry, probably the second, first. And Lycuricia was able to marry her second husband, who was very, very successful. However, when that second husband died, the king then put Lycuricia into the Tower of London until he made sure he got funds from her, which he used for building Westminster Abbey. So this was real. This was the situation of English Jews that, again, just began to deteriorate until you got to 1290 and the expulsion of the Jews. There was also, 1190, the Clifford Tower massacre, but that was considered a mistake. So, yeah, things were going downhill for Jews in England at the time.
Maybe there's a novel in that about her.
Well, Lycuricia, I mean, it was fascinating to think, actually, now King Charles, then it was Prince Charles, was supposed to attend the erection of the Lycuricia statue, but he had COVID. Yeah, there are a lot of, fascinating unknown people.
Your book has many very strong female characters. What was really, in reality, were there women besides the one you just mentioned, who were very, very self-assured and strong and powerful, or besides the historical woman you just mentioned?
People, again, there are some people who are known, but some people lost to history, and you kind of have to look at things with what evidence you do have. So, for example, people have asked me, were there female physicians, for instance, who were trained at Salerno? We don't have record of female Jewish physicians. There was one Catholic one who was very famous, named La Trota, who wrote a book called La Trotula. But we don't have record per se of Jewish female physicians, but what we do know is that Cecil Roth, the historian, wrote about the title there was for Jewish female physicians. So even though we don't know that there are specifically any, there was a title for them, which implies that there were Jewish female physicians.
What was the title?
I was just trying to think about that, and I have to kind of
Okay.
look at that and come up with it. Yeah.
A wonderful character is Nina. Did you base her on anyone in your own life or in history?
The short answer is no.
Okay.
But in Ivanhoe, there was no mother mentioned for Rebecca. It was just she and her father, Isaac. So from that, I posit that her mother probably either died in childbirth or was absent in general. And Nina, who was the servant for the couple who owned the home that then Rebecca inherited in Salerno, becomes a mother figure. She of course takes care of her. She feeds her a lot of food, and she's bossy and concerned, and that seems to be, the role that she takes there.
Did you do any research on the food of the time?
I did, yeah. And certainly in that area, and for someone who was comfortable financially, the food was quite good. We always have this tendency to think about there not being good food, but their food was fresh, and they had good access to it.
Another character is Raphael.
Mhm.
And he is a doctor, but he doesn't heal people. Instead, he translates medical texts. Why did you have him choose that profession?
Okay, he doesn't translate only medical text. And one of the things, first of all, my passion is language, so I kind of had to get that in there somewhere. But what Raphael's goal was to keep Hebrew alive in the way of having new vocabulary to deal with what was discovered in medicine and in the other sciences, and in other areas. So, sometimes to translate the text, they would have to create the vocabulary that would work linguistically. And so that was very much why Raphael, first of all, got the education that he did, and then never practiced because he always wanted to devote himself to preserving and advancing the Hebrew language. And that was actually, we always seem to think, well, Hebrew was kind of dead, during the interval between the Israelites in Israel and current state. But in fact, there was always this effort to keep it current. And that's what Raphael devotes himself to. And then he involves Rebecca with that as well.
The plot, and I'm trying not to give away too much, revolves around a rogue crusader or an innocent crusader, but maybe he was rogue, but anyhow, and his murder, and someone in the community, a visiting rabbi from Egypt, who really comes across very aggressive and not our favorite character, and Rebecca and Raphael's commitment to finding out who really murdered the crusader. Why were they, they endangered themselves. They went on a sea voyage. They, besides getting plagues and diseases, which were rampant in those days without modern medicine, why were they so committed to finding the Egyptian rabbis to be innocent?
That was kind of, again, they gave their passion to that. First of all, as far as crusaders go, there were many, many rogue crusaders. This book takes place in 1205, which is after what's considered the failure of the Fourth Crusade. And again, this really happened. The Crusaders, on the whole, were not a nice bunch of people. especially for Jews. And with this particular group had gotten as far as Constantinople, when evidently things fell apart, they weren't getting paid and so on. And they sacked Constantinople, which was a Christian city. So if they're going to be treating Christians like that, you can imagine that Jews and Muslims weren't going to fare too well with them. After they sacked Constantinople, they started filtering back to Europe. And again, they were doing this in raggedy fashion, different places and so on. When they got to Salerno, they had no hesitation to prey on the community. There was a lot of rape, rape, robbery, and other kinds of abuse. Now, because the Pope and the regent, the king's regent, all supported the Crusaders, the Duke and other people had to really tread carefully as far as trying to rein in the crime that these people were doing. So the population was tense. They were enduring crimes. And again, the whole atmosphere was kind of deteriorating from where it had been. The Egyptian rabbi comes and really disrupts the community by delivering a very harsh sermon. That's his introduction to the community. Soon after he's there, a crusader is murdered, and he is on the scene. So he's arrested for this. Rebecca and Raphael are convinced of his innocence, and they are very much committed to pursuing justice. So they feel, even though this rabbi was not a really nice person, etc., that they want to make sure that justice is done and that he is not executed for a crime he did not commit.
So the story seems very, in many ways, contemporary. You have a region which was very tolerant, and slowly in the book you see more and more prejudice against Jews. And we can look at a few things that are happening today in the United States. Not the same thing, but a surge in anti-Semitism. What were some of the stereotypes that were present in this century, the 12th century, against Jews?
Well, certainly this feeling of they're wealthy and it's really unfair. And why should they have this wealth? Why, what have they done to have this and not share it with other people? That was one. And then that they are greedy and want to hold this, for themselves. And there was all the usual libels that these people killed Christ. This was very much, a thought.
So we have England, we later have Barcelona, we have Salerno. Where else were the majority of Jews living, and which regions welcomed Jews at that time?
Well, that's a really good question. There were the Jews who were at that point in Spain, who were associated with Spain and Portugal, with the Arabs, who were really considered the intellectual leaders. So they were there, and then there were the Jews of Ashkenaz, who were, France, Germany, creating Yiddish language, so on. Where were the Jews welcome? Well, they seemed to get along with the Arabs. So where the Arabs were okay, the Jews were okay for the most part, kind of second tier. But it was going downhill everywhere.
You have characters related to the Mendoza family with
Mhm.
several brothers who were very powerful. Were they based on any historical Jewish families?
No, they are totally my own creation.
Well, very, very good characters.
Thank you.
What
They're based on
professions?
some of my relatives,
Oh,
actually.
okay. Well, we won't share that too much, but because each brother's a bit different. Uh,
Mhm.
what professions were Jews allowed to assume at that time, whether it was in Spain or in Ashkenaz or in uh, uh, Sicily?
Well, certainly money, lenders and merchants. A few, certainly in Salerno, were allowed to practice medicine, and in the Spanish areas as well.
So, if you made your book into a miniseries or a movie, who would you cast? That's
That's such a good question. How many people have seen Lucifer? Okay, and now Tom Ellis, before he gets too much older, would be Raphael, and possibly Gal Gadot as Rebecca.
okay. Not bad, not bad. Let us know when it's made into a
Right.
film. Um, you write in your autobiography, well, in your bio, that you collect books. How many do you have?
I can hear my husband laughing. I have no idea.
Okay.
Many, many, many.
All right. I welcome everyone to write in some questions in the chat function and ask you another question. What is your next book?
Okay, my next book may be, I was telling Riva, I wrote a novel that was published in 2003 that was a fictionalized, well, somewhat novelized version of my parents' story. My parents were Holocaust survivors from Poland, and I changed the names. I also made Queen Esther a character, which is what made it a novel, because she really isn't. But I so much has happened in the 20 years since that was published that I'm thinking of updating it. One example is that my mother's village in Poland reached out to me because they wanted to know what happened to the Jews from the village. This was earth-shaking because the village had seemed to me like Camelot. It didn't even seem like a real place. And all of a sudden, the people there reached out and said, "We're a real place, and we want to know what happened to the Jews." So that's one of the things that's happened in the 20 years since. One other thing I just also want to state before I guess we have any questions. One of the things I'd love to see happen is that Walter Scott gets a recognition for creating the character of Rebecca, which is really pretty remarkable. He was, a Scotsman, and I don't know that he had any contact with Jews or any real association. And is that, where did this come from? So the urban legend was that he based Rebecca on the character of Rebecca Gratz, who was an American. And I don't know if there are people here who are from Philadelphia, but Rebecca Gratz is especially very famous there. She was from a very prominent, wealthy family in Philadelphia area. And she was very philanthropic, very cultured, very educated. And about half of her family did intermarry. She evidently had a romance with a Christian man and didn't marry him. She stayed single. So how might Rebecca Gratz have come to the attention of Walter Scott? Well, one of the people she helped to take care of was the fiance of the writer Washington Irving. And this fiance unfortunately died. And Washington Irving was heartbroken, and he went to Europe to kind of recover. And evidently he did hang out with Walter Scott. So it would be very tempting, it is very tempting to say, well, Walter Scott learned about Rebecca Gratz and he used her as a model for a Jewish character. This has never been fully proven. And it's, again, a mystery. And in fact, it is recorded that Rebecca Gratz read Ivanhoe and enjoyed it. And people said, well, were you the model for this Rebecca? And she was very coy about it. So it would be wonderful to be able to prove definitively that, yeah, Rebecca Gratz was the model for Rebecca, but that hasn't happened yet.
So there's a movie and a miniseries that I know of about Rebecca and Ivanhoe. One was many decades ago. And Robert Taylor, I believe, was it, am I correct, was Ivanhoe. And then
Yeah. There was a 1950s movie of Ivanhoe, very Hollywood. Elizabeth Taylor was Rebecca, and Joan Fontaine was Rowena. This is a movie not to watch, not recommended. And there was also a Hollywood movie in the 80s, and that also evidently, I think it went straight to, I don't even know what at that point. There's a miniseries from the BBC from 1997 that is excellent. So if you would like to watch a movie of Ivanhoe, I would recommend going to the library and borrowing their mini series. Read the book, listen to it, but so I'd like to see Israel have a Walter Scott stamp or something to say, wow, this guy really, he did something significant. I'd like to see it recognized.
anyone have questions? In the meantime, we'll give you a few more minutes. What, besides your own book, which we recommend people getting at one of our several, I won't say many, independent bookstores, whether it's Rakestraw or Flashlight or Orinda, and just because it's there, also Barnes and Noble recently reopened in Walnut Creek in a slightly smaller store than it had, but at least it has a decent sized collection of books. What historical fiction of the past few years would you recommend besides your book? Anything that pops out?
Well, okay, the first book that actually was very, I thought, beautifully written, but very depressing, was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell. And very unfortunate book to be published at the time of COVID because it's dealing with the plague. But it's just beautifully, beautifully written. That's one that I would recommend. As far as recent ones. Now, going back a little bit further, there was the writer Ariana Franklin, who inspired me because she had a heroine educated in Salerno who went to England. And she wrote a four-book series on this. She ended the fourth book on a cliffhanger and died, which was very frustrating for readers. But excellent, excellent book. There are really a lot of good historical books. So Maggie O'Farrell has another one that just came out, I think called Portrait of a Marriage, which I haven't read yet, but it's supposed to be equally good.
Since there aren't any questions in the chat, I do want to recommend again Rebecca of Solerno. It's easily available, a great Hanukkah or Christmas or Kwanzaa gift for people. And I think also very good for teenagers to learn an expansive view of Jewish history, which they probably don't know about the impact of the Crusaders and the different kings of England and how Jews were used for collecting taxes and then expelled. Again, next week, we're going to hear from the author of Coco at the Ritz, about the secret life of Coco Chanel. Thank
And
you.
I think
Yeah.
there's a question.
There is. The Ivanhoe series, I guess it means the British one, because that's the series and not the film, is available on Amazon Prime.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I think there's a question, Reva,
is.
from
It's
is
Joanne
it
K.
Joanne?
Yes,
okay, yeah, Joanne.
thank you. Had Shakespeare, did he know any Jews at all? Were they invited back? I know Cromwell invited the Jews to return, but I don't, if you know, before I look it up, when
There was
Cromwell
a physician, if you want to say anything. There was presumably a physician. You want to say something, Esther?
Yeah, my understanding is that they were still expelled. That
That's what I
that
thought.
Shakespeare didn't know any Jews, and he had just based his play Merchant of Venice on another older play, yeah, from Italy, or another older piece of literature. So no, he didn't know any.
What's very interesting to me is when the kids go to school, they only hear about the expulsion in 1492, and they don't ever hear about what England did, which
Yeah.
is always interesting to me.
Yeah, there's once you start looking and think about how much is lost, because you don't have to look too far, for instance, to find someone like Licoricia, who I was just speaking about. And she managed to rise to the level of being recognized and remembered, but so much is lost. And yeah, you're right, they've never spoke about other expulsions, but they were there. And how bad things got before the expulsions. Knowing that that Licoricia's money went to build Westminster Abbey. And among the missing things, yeah. So, and I think there's a question in the chat.
Do you want to say anything about both you and Rebecca being refugees? Good question.
This is an interesting thing, that actually recognizing the refugee aspect of the story came pretty late for me. But in fact, she's a refugee, because at the end of Ivanhoe, she was nearly burned at the stake. Ivanhoe intervened when he was recovering from a wound, and he managed to save her by a duel. But Rebecca and her dad could look at each other and say, do we want to stick around for part 2 of this? It's time to leave. And so they were refugees, and at that point, Barcelona was still a reasonable place. So I posited family in Barcelona, and then she hears about Salerno, which again was a reasonable place. And she's going. But this really does fit into the whole millennial pattern of Jews being refugees. And one of the people who did write a review on it on Amazon, the question becomes, how do you know when it's time to leave? My family didn't leave Poland in time. And my grandmother, for whom I was named, could have left Poland, but she didn't. And how do you know?
You don't.
And of course, once you do know, you can't necessarily leave, which is the other part of that. But this is not a new story, and it's not a new question. And the cycle does repeat. So yeah, this was not my first attraction to Rebecca, but it was a realization that came late as to part of why she captured my imagination.
Thank you again, Esther. We look forward to your next book. We'll have to see what it is. And to everyone, hope to see you at Cocoa at the Ritz and future Under One Tent programming. To see our long lineup of events, go to underonetent.org. And I want to thank Joanne, who just asked the previous question, who is chair of Under One Tent on behalf of the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center. Everyone, and happy gobble gobble Thanksgiving. Be well, be safe.
Okay. And I just also would like to say, I'm always happy to answer questions or talk about the book. So, at a later point, if a question comes up that you would like, please don't hesitate to contact me, because I'm happy to.
And what we can do is you can go to underonetent.org, email us, and we will forward the question and your email to our author. Thank you again, everyone. Be safe, be healthy, and thank you for joining us for today's author talk and buy the book. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.